You are listening to the Hiking Radio Network, where we talk the walk with shows by hikers, about hikers, for everybody.
Mighty Blue on the Appalachian Trail, the ultimate midlife crisis. Join Steve and his guests every week as he staggers from Georgia to Maine.
Hey guys, thanks for coming back to join me on the podcast. You're listening to Mighty Blue on the Appalachian Trail, the ultimate midlife crisis. I'm your host, Steve Adams, sometimes known as Mighty Blue, and today we have another Brit as our main guest. Andy Hood is a listener who reached out to me a while ago about his upcoming plans for a journey along the southwest coast path in England. And Andy didn't intend to hike it. He was going to run 170 miles of the 800-odd mile path in just 7 days. But it was Andy's personal story and his way of articulating it that drew me in. As he says, running a trail is much like hiking a trail, only faster. Certainly in my case. And since I know a number of you would like me to introduce other trails to you, then this is your chance to learn about a new one. After Andy, we've got Dave from Mountain Harbour Bed and Breakfast in Roan Mountain, and very well known for its epic breakfast. I called Dave out of the blue, and trooper that he is, he agreed to be interviewed with just 5 minutes' notice. Finally, today we hear from George Stefanos and his almost catastrophic hike into Petersburg. This is the part of the book that we learn where the title of the book actually came from. So let's get going and meet Andy Hood. So today's guest is Andy Hood. Andy has written to me a couple of times over the past couple of years and is a listener to the show. Hey Andy, how are you?
I'm well, Steve. How are you?
Well, I'm good. And I want to warn listeners straight away that this isn't another AT story. And you can probably tell by his accent that Andy is, like me, a Brit. And I'm going to start, Andy, by reading a blog post that I read just last week as I was cyber stalking you, as I kind of have to do. And this blog post really caught my attention. And it says, I found myself in early 2021 with my mum, who had just lost her sister Claire. Mum was one of four. She had two sisters and a brother. With Claire's passing, Mum had lost all her siblings. I considered how that would feel, knowing those you grew up with were no longer a phone call or a car drive away. Tough. That's got to feel tough to reconcile. I believe Mum was feeling that. Claire was being well looked after in a beautiful home in East Sussex. She had dementia. In a moment, I knew what to do. In that moment, I'd do something tough too. It was a way in which I could say to Mum, I know this time of your life is tough. I feel it too. A run to Land's End would be tough on me. It seemed fitting. And I'll try and raise a little for the Alzheimer's Society along the way. Date set, September 2021. I'd head west from home along the coast path, stopping when I reached Land's End, photo by the iconic sign. Now, there is a next line, but I'm going to save that and come back to it in a moment.
Okay.
So we're going to start with that blog post. Your mother had lost effectively her last sibling. You wanted to do what exactly? Was it to demonstrate empathy for a difficult situation by doing something you knew would be difficult for you?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it in a nutshell, Steve. I could see Mum's emotions. She was finding that time really hard. I think she'd lost over the last few years. Her brother she'd lost when she was quite young. She'd lost her other sister who lived on Jersey. And then Claire, Auntie Claire to me, who had dementia. She'd been living in a home in East Sussex for quite some time. She was the closest geographically, and I think they were the closest growing up as well as siblings. And it was so obvious to see something that Mum had not said, and that was, I'm suddenly the last one. And I could see that in Mum's eyes. I could see that when I was talking to her, and it really struck a chord in me that although she wasn't saying it, it was something that was probably the first thought on her mind most mornings when she woke up.
Yeah, funny that, isn't it? It's funny how, not funny, but it's probably not the word, but strange how death in your family tends to, I remember being orphaned at age 41, and that's not a young age necessarily to be orphaned, but I felt literally cast out I was alone for the first time in my life. I still had my brothers, and I've since lost one of those. So, that feeling of being so close in. So you're a family man with three kids and so on. You decided you want to do something tough, and that something was, and this is one of the things obviously that related to hiking for me anyway. You talk about this West Coast path, and I've heard about it in the past. And a lot of people here don't know about the geography of the UK, and particularly about this path. So talk to us about what this path is, because it sounds awesome to hike as well as to run, I'm sure.
It is awesome to hike, and it's definitely one you want to be putting on your list of places to go and hike. It's 630 miles in total. It starts on the North Somerset coast in a place called Minehead, and it wraps itself really snugly around that bottom southwest corner of the UK, swinging round the bottom and then coming back around towards Dorset. So it's both north and south coast. And it starts in Minehead in Somerset, progresses into Devon, Cornwall, wraps around the bottom end of Cornwall, touches back again into the south coast of Devon, and finishes at Christchurch, which is near Poole in Dorset.
Yeah.
And it is majority of it, apart from where it intersects some towns and you can't help but go on a bit of tarmac, it is generally all off road and very closely hugging the coast the whole way down.
And it only goes into towns as it hits seaside towns, I presume, does it, or does it go round them? How does it cope with towns?
It generally has to go through them, and unless there is an obvious path between the town and the high cliff or even low cliff seaside, it will go through some of the towns. So, for example, I went across the beach heading towards Perranporth, which is in Cornwall. And it only skirts for probably a few hundred yards through Perranporth as you climb back up the hill past the Youth Hostel Association's place and back out onto the coast path again on the cliff higher up. But other times, such as around Hale in Cornwall, you've actually got to spend probably about 3 or 4 miles going through the town and navigating the other side of it as well, because there is no option. That town is right on the coastline.
So in Perranporth, you actually go on the beach. Do you go on the beach much? That'd be pretty cool.
Yeah. Do you know what? I was really fortunate on this particular time that the tide was out on the 2 main beaches that I would come across. Running in sand dunes, the other side of the beach, is not fun. I mean, you walk in sand dunes, you hike in sand dunes. It's tough ground. The beach is beautiful, and because the tide had gone out a little while ago, you had that hard pack area of sand, which is still moist, and that actually is quite a pleasure to walk on. It's absolutely a pleasure to run on.
Yeah. So your plan to show this empathy to your mother was to run, and let's talk about the logistics of that. It was to do, was it 170 miles from near your home, a place called Westward Ho, great name by the way. Always love that name. All the way to Land's End. And Land's End, for people who don't know, in England, but there's this traditional, the longest place between 2 points, or there's a walk or a cycle between Land's End on the southwest coast and John O'Groats, one of the northernmost parts of Scotland, and that's about 1,000 and something miles. You were going to do about 170 miles, was it, from Westward Ho down to Land's End in 7 days? In 7 days, yeah. So it was what is recognised as probably one of the toughest parts of the southwest coast path. There's a section of it that covers 10 river valley crossings. They're very deep. You get no flat ground at the bottom. You get no flat ground at the top. You are straight down sharp to the river valley floor, and then you kick straight back up the other side. And you are doing that 10 times over on one particular relatively small, about 15-mile stretch. So this isn't easy terrain. Yeah, you already put me off it, by the way.
No, the views are stunning, Steve. It shouldn't put you off. I'm sure they are. I mean, I know that area. I've been around that area several times. I know how beautiful it is. But what about, and hikers and runners have different ideas and different ways in which they do things. So let's talk about the certain differences there. So you were running this. Did you stop most nights in town? How did you actually logistically do it? And then we'll talk about how hikers would do it. Yeah, I've definitely done that. So I had planned it quite meticulously all the way down. I had my key points to get to every single night, the hotels or small B&Bs I was going to stay in. That gave me two things. That gave me a focal point of a place to get to, and meant that I could sort of recharge overnight. And my shortest day was 18 miles. My longest day was 32. On average, I was doing about a marathon distance most days across that terrain with anywhere between about 4,000 and 8,000 feet of vertical gain across the day. So it's such an accessible trail. It's very, very easy to get on and off. It's very easy to stay overnight. There are phenomenal public transport links, both bus and train. So it's probably one of the most accessible links, certainly long distance trails we've got in the UK.
Right. And what do people normally do? Do they normally start in Minehead, is it? Or do they start the other end at Christchurch?
Yeah, it's Minehead. So the typical way round of doing it is Minehead to all the way down to Dorset, down to Christchurch. There are others. I met others doing it the other way. I met one chap who was on his third attempt, and it alternated it each time.
All right. Oh, cool. So they start at Minehead, start heading down there. Is there a certain time of year that's better than other times? Because I know you went in your original plan was to go in 2021, but you actually went this year, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So are there logistics that you had to take into account? Is that why it's easier going one way than the other?
No, I don't think it's easier one way or the other. There's a phenomenal association, the Southwest Coast Path Association, that do a phenomenal job maintaining the whole trail. Right. It's all done by fundraising, and they produce a brilliant guidebook. In fact, the first guidebook I think they produced was the Minehead start round to Dorset, but they've also produced the reverse route as well, and that gives a lot of detail around suggested days, suggested stop points, refueling points for if you're hiking it. So the resource that's available to you actually makes it very, very easy to plan and very, very easy to decide whether you want to do the whole thing in one go, whether you want to start in one end or the other, whether you want to just jump on and do sections. And I met couples that had been hiking this for 15, 20 years and were still trying to complete small sections of it. And they have their book and they are ticking off as they go along.
You actually told me you met an Alaskan lady.
Two.
but you actually never told me the story. So tell us about the Alaskan lady you met then.
Well, I've got to say to my mum, she did a phenomenal job of keeping the Facebook page up to date. There's a Southwest Coast Path Facebook group. I'm not on Facebook, so my mum each night I'd send her a little bit of info about the day and a couple of pictures, and she would just upload it for me. What I didn't appreciate is the number of people that were actually following that quite closely. And I think this was day 3. It was a rainy day, so I had been dressed in my rain gear. The rain had just cleared, so I was getting quite warm. So I took my jacket off, packed it away, started running again. Because if you see the picture, I'm running with a very definite gear on. I was running with the same type of top. I had 2 of them with me every day, which had a couple of things on the front, so it was easily recognisable. As I came around this corner, these 2 ladies suddenly started shouting at me ahead of me, probably just 50, 75 yards ahead of me, and started waving money at me. And I'm thinking, what's going on? What's going on? And they said that they'd been reading the post. They were absolutely determined that this was the day they were going to see me. This was the best chance they were going to see me if they were going to see me. And I stopped for probably half an hour with them. Chris and Shara from Alaska, one from Juneau and the other from Anchorage. And we had the most phenomenal conversation. We chatted about our experiences. One of them's involved in ultra running out in Alaska. One of her friends runs a couple of ultra running races, and she very kindly gave me a running buff, hiking buff, which had the race details on it. But you and I were talking the other day. Running, hiking, walking. It's so easy to just think that actually this is just a foot in front of the other. I mean, running is just hiking at a slightly faster pace. But it's so
much faster pace in my case.
But it's so much more than that. And you would have experienced it. I mean, listening to your podcast, not just you, Steve, but listening to so many of your guests over the years, is the emotion that's wrapped up in those footsteps. And for me, meeting those Alaskan ladies was such an emotional moment for so many different reasons. The conversation we had, but the fact that knowing that somebody was following what I was up to.
Isn't that interesting? And it also becomes a slight, not a burden, but it becomes a responsibility you take on, don't you? I know that
Yeah.
I was blogging from my 2014 hike, and when I realised so many people were listening, were reading the blog, I felt more obliged to write longer longer blog posts. Did you have that same feeling while you were doing your run?
I did. I mean, actually, my first night, my first stop, I had no mobile signal at all. And the Wi-Fi where I had stopped was abysmal. And I actually felt guilty that I was really struggling to give an update, because I've had so many people support me leading up to the run that I felt, as you say, kind of almost a responsibility, because I knew that certain people would be on the website that I've got, checking out, seeing where I was, hoping everything was okay, interested in where I had been. And it was, you're right. Each day it was, I had to do this. I had to give this update. And I wanted to give that update.
Of course, yes. It's kind of sharing your adventure with other people. And there's something that's kind of, it fuels you as well to share that adventure with people, especially when you're getting feedback as well.
Yeah, and part of this run was about inspiring people as well, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And is, and this is a bit that confused me the other day, people camp on this trail as well. Are there prescribed campsites, or can people wild camp? Because my understanding was in England it was much more difficult to wild camp than it is in Scotland.
Yeah, it is. It is much more difficult to wild camp, but there are plenty of people that do it. Whether it's what the right side of legality is here, I'm not quite sure, because I'm not a great camper. I like my luxury of an evening.
Right.
But there are definite people. You read the posts yourself. You read some of the stories that are written, and you meet quite a lot of people out there. I met a couple of guys on day one who had decided to come out to the trail with their hiking gear, and they were really, really struggling. Yeah, they were finding, I think it was day two actually, I saw them, they were finding it significantly harder than they had ever anticipated. They didn't realise the terrain was as tough as it was. And actually I sat and chatted to them for a while and just said, it doesn't matter how far you get today, you've probably walked further than 90% of the rest of the population. So don't worry about the distance you're going to walk. Just go out and enjoy it. Stop where you need to stop. And they were wild camping. I actually saw them the following morning. They'd wild camped overnight. I found a great spot. And they were on their way again. But there are campsites. Devon and Cornwall and Dorset are holiday destinations in the UK, and it's well served, very well served. You won't have any difficulty whether you want a wild camp or whether you want a little bit more luxury of an evening.
Now, you made an observation the other day that I've thought about since, actually. You talked about, because you could have done this if you wanted to, in a loop. You could have found a loop to run there and run back and so on.
Okay.
But you talked about the difference between an end-to-end run or a hike as opposed to a loop, and that resonated with me, because I've said before on the show, I like the idea of a through hike. I don't necessarily like to hike particularly, but I like to start beginning somewhere and end somewhere else. So talk to us about that. Yeah,
you're right. And I think when we were talking about it, I was talking very much about your hike. You're starting at Springer in Georgia, you're going through to 2,000 odd miles away up in Maine. And there is something about finishing at a place other than where you started. I was thinking about it too after we spoke, and I was trying to find a way to really describe it. And actually, I don't think I can. It's a feeling inside that I have that I think many people get, that there's an excitement about getting somewhere, completing a journey. And I don't think I certainly don't get that same feeling if I'm just to do a loop. Yeah, I could have run 170 miles out my front door and come back in my front door again, but I'd be back where I started, and I'm not sure I would have completed a journey in that case.
It's funny, that's exactly how I feel. And I didn't realise it did feel that way until you articulated it in that way as well. Is that thing that it has to be a journey. A loop doesn't feel like a journey to me. It feels like, I've just come back again. Just go there and come back again. Yeah. So that was quite interesting. Now, as I say, you had this plan to do it last year, but you did it this year. Because I'm now going to read the very next sentence of that blog post. You wrote, "Cancer was to stop me in my tracks."
Yeah.
Tell us about your cancer and what actually was it and how did you discover it?
Do you know, it's a really tough time and I'm still processing it now, but I
Of
was
course.
mid-training for the run to Land's End. It's a tough run, 170 miles back-to-back days, 25,000 feet of elevation gain across there. I needed to be fit to do it. So I was running a lot. I was running on a lot of different terrain. I had been watching quite a popular TV program over here in the UK, well-known, Clarkson, Hammond and May, the Grand Tour, and they'd been joking around about one of their challenges. They were talking about prostate cancer. They were talking about checking, men checking yourself, your testicles, etc. And that kind of probably sat with me. And I had got back from a run one night, hot run one summer's evening, jumped in the shower, and that thought crossed my mind. Well, not to give you the gory details, but a phone call to the doctors the following day, into the doctors very quickly, and he had confirmed what I had found with one of my testicles had shrunk to basically the size of a marble and gone very solid, which wasn't normal. And within the space of 10 days, I had a ultrasound, and I was then in front of the urologist. And then I was on the operating table. I've had an orchidectomy, which means I've had one removed. I do joke with everybody that should theoretically increase my running speed because it makes me lighter. That's the way I look at it. And I've had some chemotherapy to follow up because I didn't spot it early enough. I had a little bit of spread outside of the testicle itself. So I had some chemotherapy really as an iron guard against whether any of those cancer cells had crept off somewhere else in the body. But I remember, and I've just been writing about this experience now, and so much emotion has come out. I've been writing over the weekend about that exact part of my life. And I've quoted Jim Lovell. I think it was Jim Lovell on Apollo 13 when he says, "We've just lost the moon." And I could hear him in my left ear saying, "Andy, you've just lost Land's End." Because there was that dawning realization that I wasn't going to be out the running shoes or walking shoes even for a matter of hours or days. This was going to be weeks ticking into months. And I knew at that point I had lost the Land's End run, and that was hard.
I bet it was. So you had chemo.
I have.
I've never had chemo. I don't know anything about it. Was that tough on you? Or did that I'm trying to think what the word is. Did that impact you physically as well? Did that drain you physically and make it even more difficult to get back into training?
Yeah, I remember sitting with the oncologist, and he was going through what the chemotherapy would look like, and he basically gave me all the side effects. And he said, "Andy, this is going to be for the next 3 days after your first chemo. It will be a bit like the worst hangover you have ever experienced in your life." Well, considering I gave up drinking in my early 20s, hangovers are something seriously in my past. So I don't actually remember the Batul thing. So
I can tell you about a few.
I should have come to you. But actually, it wasn't quite as bad as that. I did have all the other side effects, but thankfully, I didn't seem to get the terrible hangover effects he was talking about. But yes, physically, it absolutely drains you because what it essentially does is it resets your immune system. So I had to, this is a very difficult time. COVID was around, so I had to be uber careful of absolutely everything. I was drained. I felt very tired a lot of the time. I was still recovering from the operation. That took me a long time to get over recovery from the operation itself.
Sure.
But mentally, I think it was both tough, but also I found it quite inspirational. I sat down there. I was at Exeter Hospital. I was in the oncology department. I was having all my tests done before they allowed you to have your chemo that day. And I remember the nurse. I was hooked up, and she pulled off my ECG, this great roll of paper in front of her, and she just turned around and looked at me and said, "Blimey, you are fit." So. And she said, "You will come through this quite well because you're going into this as a fit individual already."
Wow. Yeah.
But there was a lady who I got chatting to sitting next to me. She was having chemotherapy too, and that was her 100th treatment that day.
Oh my gosh.
And I looked at her and I just thought, wow, you are I just found that such an inspirational, uplifting moment that, I'm not alone at this point. There are so many other people going through this at all different degrees.
So you had the operation, you had the chemotherapy, and you're now in remission, as I understand.
Yep, that's correct.
What does that mean for you long term?
Well, I get 5 years of surveillance. So you are what is classified, what's known as complete remission. And complete remission is where they fully believe that there are no cancerous cells in my body at all now. But I've got 5 years of close monitoring. So frequent blood tests. I've got another blood test due in just 2 days' time. And I've got frequent full body scans as well, where they are trying to see whether there are any cancerous cells in you.
Sure.
On the one respect, that's the most phenomenal resource to have, and to have at your disposal, the fact that you've got a close team monitoring your health to that degree for the next 5 years. The other side of it, which is a piece I didn't appreciate, is you're always waiting for something.
Of course you are.
And I met a young lady on the run. I was coming down a very steep valley drop as she was coming back up the other side. We stopped. She was hiking the trail. We stopped, and Jenny, her name was. We had a chat. She asked about the logos on my top because I was raising a bit for Macmillan Cancer Support, and she shared her own cancer journey with me. She was talking to me about she had cancer in her 20s. I told her what I was finding really tough about it, and she says actually that will pass. She says you do get used to it.
It's funny, actually. You mentioned this, you mentioned the Alaskan people and so on. Being out in the open and stopping nights and meeting other people and so on. And in the same way it does with hikers. And I'm not desperately trying to draw some tenuous link at all here, because this is what happens. You get time to speak to people, don't you? When you've done your run, or even when you're partway through your run or partway through your hike, you stay in a hostel at night and so on. How did that take you by surprise, how this organised run became something so much more than the run itself?
Oh, completely. I've been trying to find a word to describe it, and I think the only word I can possibly come up with is overwhelmed. I am completely overwhelmed by the experience. And I know when we were talking a few days ago, we were very conscious about I was running, very much about hiking. Actually, they are essentially the same thing in just a slightly different pace. You are quite often having the same interactions.
Sure.
I was very focused on not just running each day to the end. I wanted to experience the landscape I was in, which is why I trail run. I very much enjoy nature. I probably took 300 plus photographs on the way.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
But stopping and talking to people, you would sometimes, if you were walking up a hill or you just stopped for a rest, or sometimes people would just catch your eye, and you would stop and chat, and they would always ask about your run. They would ask about the story. And often you would find yourself sharing experiences with complete strangers both ways. I got a lot of stories about dementia in families because I was still raising for the Alzheimer's Society, thinking about my mum and Auntie Claire. And also I was raising for Young Minds, a young person's mental health charity as well.
Sure.
And so there were a lot of conversations about dementia and cancer, both personal and within their families. And there were tears. Frequently, we would both be in tears talking about our conversation. And you think, these are complete strangers that are meeting for the briefest moments of time in your life, and you're sharing something deeply personal. I was on the beach.
I think a trail's a platform for that, though. A trail, whether it's running or hiking, it just allows you that opportunity to tune out from other things in your life and the other distractions you have, and it lets you do this. And I can see why you do it. You were just about to say you're on the beach.
I was actually I was near the beach. I was on the slipway at a beautiful coastal village in Cornwall called Port Isaac. Now, Port Isaac is very famous. There's a lot of filming goes on there for movies, but it's most notably known for the British TV series with Martin Clunes in it, Doc Martin. That's where it's filmed.
Right.
So it gets a lot of tourist trade, although it's still very beautiful. And I decided to stop, and I grabbed myself a sausage roll and a drink, and I was sitting on the slipway. There were a couple in front of me, and they turned around, and we just started chatting. And I got chatting. He was another Andy. I got chatting away. We were talking about an hour or so. We were talking about the run. We were talking about lots of different things. And after an hour, they continued on their way, and I was packing my bits up. And he came back to me, and he handed me some money for a donation.
Nice.
And he said to me, he says, I'm 54. He says, and tomorrow morning I'm phoning my doctors for the PSA blood test, the prostate check test. He
my
says,
gosh.
if I hadn't met you today, I would never have done that. And that one moment summed up one of the reasons why I wanted to do the run, which was start the conversation. Us men are terrible about talking about our health, both physical and mental health. And it was all about being completely open and starting those conversations. And I wrote in a post, actually, before I went on the website, if just one person I speak to on this journey I'm going to go on does something about their health, then my 170 miles have been worth it.
That's very cool. I know when you wrote to me, and I'm not going to read everything you wrote because it was such a flattering email, but you said that listening to some of the people I've interviewed over the years helped you on your journey because they showed such bravery and courage and so on. So I'm glad that we had that effect on you and you had that effect on other people. It's like passing things through. Now, what about an injury? I know you got an injury on, I think it was day 6. Tell us about that.
I did. So about 2/3 of the way through, late afternoon on day 6, I was really noticing a bit of pain in my ankle, top of my foot, and very lower leg. And I was in the sand dunes around Hale, and I rolled on my foot. I rolled on my left foot in the sand dunes. I decided to get myself out of the dunes. Actually managed to get down onto the beach where it was a bit flatter and more level. And I walked for a little bit, and I'll just see how it would go. The injury overnight on the night of day 6, I was in St Ives that night. It got worse. I woke up on the morning of day 7 and I knew I couldn't run. And it would have been very unwise. The terrain is rated as severe on day 7, the route I was doing, so it was pretty tough terrain. And even if it had been, an easier day.
I hate words like that, by the way. I hate severe. The sound of severe is just...
The Southwest Coast Passbook is brilliant. They go easy, moderate, strenuous, and severe. I seem to pick up a lot of severe. But I knew I couldn't run. So you either, at times like that, you can either turn around and say, I'm done, I'm defeated, that's it, an injury stopping me, or you just reframe it. You look through the world through a different lens. You think, how am I going to do this? My ultimate goal was the photograph at Land's End. And ironically, today, Steve, the official photographs arrived in the post today.
Yes.
Great timing. But my ultimate goal was to get that photograph, to arrive under my own steam into Land's End, get to the Land's End signpost and have the official photograph done. So I had to make a call. I got a train and a taxi. I missed out a chunk of the path I knew wouldn't be sensible to do. I got down to a place called Selling Cove, which is beautiful, bottom of Cornwall, or close to Land's End in Cornwall. And I walked. In fact, it was the hardest 2 miles I've ever travelled in my life. It was, the terrain wasn't flat. I was in deep pain. I had my walking poles with me, my hiking poles with me, and I was using them as crutches. I met a lady about a half a mile out from Land's End who stopped me, chatted to me. We burst into tears with each other. We were just talking about the whole story. But I got to Land's End. The last 200 or 300 yards, as I could see that sign, I was in floods of tears because this was for my mum. This was about part closure on my cancer journey of the last year. This was about being determined to complete something under my own steam, and I did.
Nice one. And when you were done, what did it mean to your mother?
My mum's been really touched by it. And I had 2 photographs done. One I'm giving to mum. I'm going to frame up and give to my mum. Nice. We've raised quite a bit for Macmillan cancer, for Alzheimer's, and for young minds, which is nice recognition for Auntie Claire. What I hadn't told you is actually Claire's husband, Tony, also died very suddenly, not long after, very unexpectedly. So my mum's had it really, really tough. I am actually yet to see my mum. We live a reasonable distance apart. We're making plans to get together, and I dare say it will probably be a fairly emotional meeting.
I'm sure it will. I'm sure it will. And funny enough, actually, that reminded me of something else you told me, which I hadn't mentioned earlier on. When you were younger, you used to, I've got to tell listeners, you used to go and cycle to see your mum, didn't you? Now, I've cycled to see my mum when I live 3 miles away from her. How many miles did you have to cycle to your mum's?
Well, we moved away from parents. I grew up on the Surrey-Sussex border. I'm talking to you from home in North Devon. We're about 200 miles away. And I've now done it a few times, but I've ridden from here at home to my parents a couple of 100 miles away.
Did you ride back or what? Put the bike on a train?
No, I put the bike. No, the rest of the family was sensible. They went in the people carrier, so I stuck the bike in the back of the car and got a lift home.
Oh dear! Look, this isn't a hiking story, but this is a person's story on a trail, and a trail that I'm interested in as a thought. It sounds like a beautiful, beautiful trail, and I really appreciate you sharing that story and also giving people that warning, especially men. Bloody idiot men that we are.
We are.
Check yourself out, get tested and see how you are. But I appreciate you coming on the show.
And this is a young man. What I had, testicular cancer, is a young man's cancer. The average age, there are 2 types of testicular cancer. One of them, the average age, 15 to 35. The other one, 15 to 55. We've got 3 boys, 16, 18 and 20. And we've brought it into the family routine. The first Tuesday of every month, we have Testy Tuesday. It's just introduced a bit of fun, but it's a serious conversation, and the boys know what they need to do.
Of course it is.
And if somebody checks as a part of us talking today and they go and seek advice and medical help afterwards, do you know what? You and I have done a great job.
That's cool. That is cool. Well, look, thanks for coming on, mate. And I'm going to put a few links in the show notes so people can just check a few things up themselves. And I appreciate you coming on here.
Thanks, Steve. It's been great to talk.
Cheers then.
Bye.
Bye. What a great story, eh? I'm not sure what happened to the audio quality. It wasn't as good as usual. Sorry about that. But Andy proved again that it isn't just walking or running. His emotions matched many of mine in California recently. And of course, it was a bit of a wake-up call when he told us about his testicular cancer. I'm now past the danger age of this disease in that area. But really, we should all check ourselves regularly. Women are so much better at self-care than us guys, and we can all do with these reminders from time to time. I meant to tell you, last week we had our Woods Hole weekend with a bunch of guests turning up at Neville's place at Woods Hole to learn from our team what hiking the Appalachian Trail can involve. From the comments I've seen, they were all pleased and enjoyed the whole thing. Luckily for us, a big bubble of soboers turned up as well, including Craig Holt Mains, and our guests couldn't fail to see how joyous they all were, revelling in the experience that they were having. It got cold, but it was sunny, so we were able to complete most of our sessions outside. As I say, the weekend was a blast, and it was good to set my feet back on the trail, if only for a few miles. Now, let's hear from another hostel owner. This is Dave from Mountain Harbour B&B. Here he is. Back in 2014, when I hiked the AT for the first time, I stayed in Mountain Harbour Bed and Breakfast, and this is Dave, who owns the place. Hey, Dave, how are you?
Good, and you?
Not too bad. And I remember it very well for a number of different reasons, and we'll talk about that in a minute. How long has the hostel actually been operating?
2003.
2000.
So next year I'll be 20 years.
Have you been there the whole time?
We have.
Wow. So what's it like running a hostel for 20 years?
It has its moments.
Give us a couple of moments in.
It's a lot more work than it appears, and we've grown substantially, especially, last time you were here is 2014. We are probably 10 times what we were then. So
really? Wow.
Yeah, there's stuff that's been added and changed and updated, and the new bars going in and common area, and the hostel itself is different. The general store and the food truck.
Wow, food! Oh, hang on. There certainly wasn't a food. There certainly wasn't a food truck back then. From my memory, there was the house. There was with the breakfast, which we're going to talk about in a minute. There was the barn, and there was some open camping out the back as well. Does that still exist?
Yes, and there's a tree house out there.
Oh right, I think that was the tree house back there in 2014.
I was probably building. I didn't get it finished till 2015.
Oh, right. Okay. Right. Yeah. I think I seem to remember someone talking about it. But yeah, I stayed out back because I was a bit of a cheapskate. But I did come in. I did come in and have the breakfast. And I know you're famous for your breakfast. How did that get so extravagant? I mean, it was absolutely beautiful.
Well, when we first started, Mom and Dad, it wasn't supposed to be a hostel.
All right.
They had bought what they thought was a bed and breakfast. They were going to run for a few years,
right,
until they would finish retiring. And first year they were here, the first spring.
Yep.
3 hikers with ice and stuff on their beards showed up at the door looking for a place to stay.
Right. Yeah.
and in fact, the year before last, they were back for the first time. 2 of them. 2 of those original.
How cool is that?
Yeah, it was very cool because it's a whole different place than it was then. But one thing led to another, and next thing you know, we had a hostel.
From my memory, when you turn up, you come into the house from, I think there was the barn, and I was camping actually in my tent, but you come in and there's this huge array of stuff, and it's a sort of self-serve thing, isn't it?
Not anymore.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, tell us what you do now then.
So most of the area in the driveway is parking. So we hold about 75 to 80 cars because we do a lot of shuttling for section hikers.
Right, yeah.
Very, very popular. So, I mean, we run a bus and we have 3 Suburbans and Escalades and a couple of buses and vans. I think we have 9 vehicles we run shuttles with. So we do that. So we have a lot of parking area. And in fact, the mountain, we've had to put a second parking lot up on the mountain.
Wow.
But there's a trail that comes in the backside, so you don't have to come all the way. Back when you came in, you had to walk all the way down to the driveway.
When I came in, let me think. Well, yeah, when I came in, because I got off at 19E, I think, and walked about half a mile uphill, was it? Maybe not even half a mile, maybe a quarter of a mile uphill to where you were on the right. Is that right?
Downhill. On the right, yep.
Is it down? Oh, okay, downhill. Because I came from Carver's Gap.
Yep.
And walked across the Jane Board and Hunt Mountain. It was just beautiful, beautiful hike. And then I seem to remember it was uphill, but it's downhill, was it? Okay.
Yep.
I came in there, and the next day you slack pat me somewhere, and it wasn't back to Carver's Gap, obviously. It
had been north, so we probably went to Forest Service 293. Which is about halfway to Dennis Cove.
Right. And then we came back that night and I stayed again. Mainly because I wanted another breakfast. Yeah. And I want to go back to the breakfast bit because obviously that's what the place is really, really famous for. Was it always, as I say, extravagant as that? It was just such a beautiful breakfast. And I see you put your price up this year to $15, which is still not much at all for the breakfast I had. Was it always all that great cooking? Because there was some beautiful stuff all around.
It was, because that was what Mom did, and that was part of her idea of the bed and breakfast. Like I said, the hikers and a hostel weren't ever thought. In fact, they didn't even know there was a trail here.
Oh, really?
So, 'cause they weren't hikers. We didn't.
Right.
Like I said, it wasn't something we set out to do. So she did breakfast the way she knew how and the way she wanted to, and it just kind of took off. And, back then there was no cell phones. There was no Facebook.
Sure.
There was none of that, but word traveled on the trail fairly quickly.
Yeah, still does, yeah. In fact, I hiked again in 2019, and for some reason I couldn't stay with you guys. I can't remember why. Maybe it wasn't
probably
space.
Full.
Yeah, probably, that's a good reason for it. Yeah, appreciate that. But yeah, because I left everything to the last minute to book anywhere, to be honest with you. And do you shuttle? I can't remember. Do you shuttle people into town as well, or do you do laundry on site?
Not anymore, because everything they need is here, and we couldn't keep up with going. We used to go to town in the evenings. We used to run one trip, but in 2017 I had the trailer built, which is a food truck. So we have a full kitchen down there, and we serve in, dinner and stuff out of the food truck.
So are you open all year round as a bed and breakfast anyway?
We are.
So how do the hikers and the normal people mix, or don't they?
Well, I'd say 95% of our our guests are all hikers anyways. I mean,
Oh,
hikers
right,
stay
okay.
in the bed and breakfast as well as they do, in the hostel or in the treehouse or in the campground or wherever. Just about all of them are hikers. They're all up here to go.
And how many do you accommodate each day in a high season when it's really busy? How many can you accommodate?
We have beds for 20 between the bed and breakfast, the hostel, and the treehouse. Sleeps 20.
Right. And
And
you
then
still do the camping as well?
Yeah, and we've had as many as 30 or 40 tents out there. So
Because we tend to squeeze in, don't we, as cheapskates?
well, there's a lot more room out there now.
Oh, is there? Right. Okay, cool. So how can people reach you or find out more about the hostel? You've got a website, I presume, haven't you?
Yeah, mountainharbor.info.
Okay, mountainharbor.info. And I should tell everybody that for some reason, harbour is spelled Harbour, which is normally
Yep.
the English way of spelling it. Is there any history to that? Why you've got a U in it?
Well, the people that Mom and Dad bought it from and had set it up as a bed and breakfast had a big boat that they kept down at Watauga Lake.
Uh-huh.
And their idea was dinner cruises and romantic stuff like that.
Cool.
So basically, Mountain Harbor was a safe harbor in the mountains, much like a harbor is on the ocean. It's a safe place for the boats. So that was kind of where it originally came from. And then when Mom and Dad bought it, they just kept the name.
With the U. I remember it was almost striking to me when I came in 2014 because I've never heard it spelt that way over here. So it's Mountain Harbor, HARBOUR, .net, and they can find you there.
Yep.
Cool. Okay, man. Well, look, I appreciate you talking to me at such short notice because, to be fair, I only reached out to Dave about 5 minutes ago. And so thanks for coming on, and I wish you well for next season.
Oh, yeah, we'll be here and we'll be busy as usual. Nothing seems to keep anybody away. So,
yeah. Okay, then. We'll take it easy, okay? Enjoy it. Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.
I must apologise to Dave for the lack of any notice, but if you're going to be out on the trail, give Mountain Harbour a try. The breakfast is a real winner, and you can sleep in luxury or be a cheapskate like me. The choice is yours. By the way, the website is at Mountain Harbour, mountainharbour.info. I messed up a bit by saying .net once. It's mountainharbour.info. We have a couple of donors to thank again this week. Monthly donors Woody Bass and Letitia Webb stepped up again, and we had a new donor, Gail Posey, who was actually one of our guests at the Woods Hole weekend. So thanks everybody for your steadfast support. If you'd like to support our efforts, then head on over to the Hiking Radio Network website where you can click on a donate button and make either a one-off or a monthly donation. Thank you very much. Finally today, George Stephanos reveals why he titled his book, Then the Hail Came. When you hear it, then I think you'll agree it is a very apt title. I'll see you next week. Wednesday the 15th of June 1983. Mile 569.4. I left a somewhat snotty entry in the register at Jenkins Shelter this morning, pointing out that the mention of those cliffs in my guidebook must have been a mistake, as that particular bit of trail description had obviously been intended for the Braille version. I also whined about the condition of yesterday's trail. That is the way through hikers are. Engaged in an extremely difficult undertaking, we pout and sulk every time the trail is not to our liking. I'm as bad as any, but I like to think I at least pout a little bit more wittily than most. The 4 backpackers I met yesterday morning at Knot Mole Branch Shelter showed up at Jenkins Shelter last night. I noticed that one of the preppies hikes in a polo shirt with an alligator on the chest. One does not often have the opportunity to meet a walking cliché. I was too exhausted from the long hike I had made and the sleepless night preceding it to talk to them much, but I did have the privilege of lying there in my sleeping bag listening to the preppies drone on about such fascinating subjects as wine and how eggs are really bogus without cheese. At least their conversation helped me to get the sleep I needed. I slept until 7:30 this morning and did not get out on the trail until 9 o'clock. It was very hot again today, and the air was even more sodden than yesterday as the sun drew the moisture left behind by last night's thunder showers from the ground. Fortunately, the trail has improved quite a bit since Garden Mountain. Most of the hike followed the long, low, level crest of Brushy Mountain through woods on a well-graded trail. It was rather uneventful. Towards the end of this short day, the Appalachian Trail descended into a low gap on Brushy Mountain, where I-77 and US routes 21 and 52 all cut across the ridge. From there, you can follow US 21 and 52 steeply down the south slope of the ridge for about a mile to the town of Bland, Virginia, and find groceries, meals and lodging. The other 4 hikers all went down into Bland, and I was very tempted to join them. They were not bad guys, and it is difficult to pass up such amenities when one is a week past his last trail town. I did not go, however. I felt the need to watch myself today. Weary and depressed, I'm on the verge of chucking this whole adventure. I knew that if I went down into Bland, I would get a room there tonight, and I was not sure I could make myself return to the AT tomorrow. A new shelter called Helvy's Mill is about a mile past the gap, and that's where I'm staying tonight after a big 13.7 mile day. Mother Nature rewarded my valiant decision to pass up Bland by conjuring up a heavy thunder shower out of nowhere and drenching me to the bone on that last mile. I got into my rain gear very quickly. I've had lots of practice. I trotted out a few well-worn curses and my equanimity was somewhat restored. I quickly covered that soggy mile to the shelter and arrived just as the rain was stopping, naturally. There have been a couple of sprinkles since I've arrived, but that has been it. It does seem to have turned a bit cooler in the wake of that thunder shower. I can live with that. The walk from the shelter to its water supply was brutal. The trail was 350 yards, all straight down a precipitous hill. I filled both of my water bottles and my largest pan so I need not make that trek again tomorrow morning. The spring was excellent, but I staggered like a drunk on the tortuous climb back up. I had a huge dinner. I've not been that hungry outside of a restaurant since Damascus. I can feel the proximity of another trail town. I'm beginning to once more hear the siren song of cheeseburgers. It's 7:30 and I'm going to turn in soon. I have a big day planned for tomorrow. I'll have to hike 11 miles to reach the next water and another 12 miles past that to the next shelter. The preppies told me that after dinner and some grocery shopping in Bland, they will be joining me at this shelter, but it appears they decided to stay in town. They turned out to be decent guys, but I'm not in the mood tonight to hear about French cuisine or Muffy's trip to Europe anyway. Someone created a fantastic ink sketch on the back of the shelter register notebook. A beautifully intricate evergreen forest with a pretty girl in a bikini standing in the foreground, her arms outstretched in a gesture of welcoming. The trees extend far into the distance to the base of a massive monolith. Hovering above the peak is the single letter K. The caption reads, "Maine awaits you." I feel that the artist truly captured the poetry of the through hiker's quest. It touched me deeply. Sometimes I feel that my recognition of the poetry of my own endeavour is the only thing that keeps me going. I find something deeply moving in the concept of a weak man who has finally come to know and hate what he is on a desperate quest for redemption and a mythical mountain where he hopes to meet a man with a strong fighting spirit, a man who exists now only in his imagination. He must be insane to dream this absurdity. He knows that. He also knows deep in his heart that his stupid quest must fail, because he has always failed in every undertaking that ever truly mattered. How can he change the person that he is? Yet he trudges the weary miles and every once in a while picks up the fragments of his crumbling soul and scotch tapes them back together. How long will the tape job hold this time? How many times will he have to perform this operation before a new man can stand, strong and confident, in those North Maine woods, savouring the sight of his dream mountain? How many times can a weak man pick his guts up off the ground and continue striving towards a vision that he does not really believe he will ever see be made real? Shit, I'm babbling. I'm going to bed. Maine awaits me. 1,569.1 more miles to go. Thursday, the 16th of June 1983, mile 592.5. It rained lightly, off and on, throughout the night. The typical southern summer weather pattern seems to have settled in. Hot, steamy days with a watery apricot sun struggling to pierce the haze, thunderous cloudbursts every afternoon, and light showers at night. Morning sunlight glistens off millions of tiny beads of water as the sodden forest greets the new day. The hot sun draws all that moisture up into the air. Humidity soars until the atmosphere begins to cool slightly in the evenings and is unable to retain all that moisture. The rains come again. This kind of self-sustaining cycle can go on for days, weeks, months. I left the shelter this morning at 6 o'clock, a manfully early start for a change. As a matter of fact, it was my earliest start of the trip, which was good because I was trying for my biggest day yet, 23 miles. The air was still cool and walking was pleasant. The only drawback was that the grass was still soaked from last night's rains, and the Appalachian Trail trod grassy old woods roads all morning. I had to stop several times in the first few hours just to wring brown water out of my socks and insoles. My boots are now waterproof, only in my dreams. After about 10 miles, the AT descended off Brushy Mountain and followed a country road for 1.5 miles before turning off into the woods for a half-mile of level footpath. Then it got sick for a short stretch, the only piece of bad trail I ran into all day. Of course, I inevitably hit this portion just as the sun triumphed over the morning mists and the day became tropical. For a half-mile, the trail shot straight up the precipitous north flank of Brushy Mountain, all the way up to the wooded crest. By the time I made it to the top, I'd broken all the old sweating records I had established on this hike. I was more soaked from my own perspiration than I had been in all but the heaviest rainstorms. At that moment, I would cheerfully have shot the man who laid out that trail. The AT, upon reaching the crest, immediately plunged down the steep southern flank of the mountain to a road. I followed that road for a while before following another road through a gap in the mountain back to the same damn side of the mountain I'd been on when all this started. I plodded along, shaking my head and muttering to myself. Luckily, a small general store was located like a gift from heaven about a quarter mile past the point where the Appalachian Trail once again left that road to re-enter the woods on the north side of Brushy Mountain. I bought 2 Cokes and a pint of chocolate ice cream for some emergency attitude adjustment surgery. I also bought some spice cakes and a box of frosted blueberry Pop-Tarts for the trail. The world always seemed a little less grey with frosted Pop-Tarts in the backpack. Finally, I picked up a new copper pot scrubber to replace the one I'd forgotten at a shelter. The pretty lady running the store told me that there was a picnic table outside under an enormous shade tree, and I was welcome to use it. I sat down, ate the ice cream and guzzled the Coke, and my inner core temperature seemed to drop a degree. I felt reborn. A cute little short-haired tan mongrel made friends with me during this long and necessary rest. I started to lose that good feeling during the climb up through the woods from the road, but I had shrewdly stashed the other Coke in my backpack for just such a moment. I chugged it down and blew away the remainder of that climb. The final 5 miles of the day were the nicest and most scenic portion of the Appalachian Trail since the Virginia Highlands. In the slanting sunlight of a soft June evening, the trail wandered through a place called the Dismal Creek Valley. It was nothing like its name. I trod beautiful old grassy woods roads that were gentle on my feet, bruised and battered from all the miles I had already walked, through an incredible variety of forests in that secluded valley. One moment I would be in a grove of giant white pines, the next a dense tangled jungle of rhododendron, and the next a quiet hardwood forest carpeted with ferns. I saw 6 white-tailed deer along the trail and heard many more of them crashing through the surrounding woods. The path returned to the banks of the broad, meandering creek again and again. I arrived at the Wapiti 2 shelter at 6:30, having completed 23 miles in 12.5 hours, including my long, pleasant interlude at the store. It appears Virginia is going to be as good for my daily mileage totals as I had hoped it would. I'm having a good time at this shelter tonight. The surroundings are wondrous, and I also have some good company. A man from Pennsylvania named Tom, who is slowly making his way up from Springer Mountain to his home state, and a fellow from North Carolina who is hiking with 2 dogs. Tom is a character. I enjoyed his entry in the Helvy's Mill Register, which began another grueling 2.5-mile day. One of the dogs is the large black male mutt who fought Sonny in Hot Springs. The other is a tiny female Pomeranian. She's very friendly for a small dog. She likes to make herself right at home on top of my sleeping bag every time I get up. The male is an expert beggar, an art he practiced continually throughout my meal. The owner had some friends drive him up from Irwin, where I briefly met him, to Pearisburg. Now he's hiking back down to Irwin. Some through hikers do that rather frequently. We call it a flip-flop. He says that he will probably flip-flop up to Katahdin once the black fly season ends in Maine and hike back south. It appears I'm not the only backpacker growing weary of southwestern Virginia. This shelter has an aura of infamy. Last year, 2 backpackers were robbed and murdered here by local people. I can see why they picked this spot. It's way out in the middle of nowhere. Things must have gotten pretty gory. The shelter now sports a new floor. I'm exactly 16 miles from the road into Petersburg. I still have a chance to make the post office tomorrow afternoon by 5 if I can get any kind of early start in the morning. Never say die. Friday, the 17th of June, 1983, miles 608.5, Petersburg. I stayed up very late last night, laughing and joking with my sheltered companions. I especially like Tom. He has that warped and twisted sense of humour to which I can relate. Too bad he's just crawling along the trail. Hiking with him could be interesting. I woke up late and started late this morning, considering what I needed to do in order to make the post office. It was 7:15 by the time I left the shelter. I put a warped, twisted entry of my own in the register as I was leaving. I wrote, "On to Petersburg, where wild women run naked in the streets, raping backpackers, and the mayor drives around handing out free drugs." I do not imagine that I made any friends at the local Chamber of Commerce. I just could never seem to get it going after that long day yesterday. My legs were wobbly and my feet ached all day. I kept putting myself in a deeper and deeper hole as the hours ticked past. I was sluggish on the long climb up Sugar Run Mountain from the valley, and I was not all that hot even on the level ridge crest. I passed the 600-mile point of the Appalachian Trail about a mile before Doc's Knob Shelter. I took 45 minutes there, partaking in a lunch of peanut butter crackers and tang. Tom and some other hikers to whom I had called up were there. They had decided to stay the night, as a big thunderstorm seemed to be brewing. It was rather foolish to risk life and limb along that high ridge crest merely to make Petersburg tonight. I am nothing if not foolish. I set off again at 12:45. I had already used up 5.5 hours on the first 8 miles and had 4 hours and 15 minutes remaining to hike the last 8 miles and make my way to the post office in town. Hey, what is one more lost cause on an adventure such as this? I pushed myself hard over those final miles. There were many steep descents and I flew over them much too fast. Soon I developed the worst case of shin splints I've ever experienced in my life. My right shin felt broken. Despite that, I chugged doggedly up the sharp climb to the ridge crest of Perez Mountain. My shins did not hurt nearly as much on the climbs as on the descents. No sooner had I begun the 3 mile of ridge walking on Perez Mountain than the sky, which had been darkening all day, turned truly ominous. Thunder boomed in the distance. I quickly threw my rain cover over my backpack just before the sky opened up. I've never seen rain like that in my life. It was like a waterfall. I could hardly breathe and was drenched to the skin in the few seconds it took to put on my rainsuit. I released my pent-up frustration with a primal scream and started to make tracks. Soon, tremendous bursts of thunder were exploding all around me. For a time, I could almost hear the thunder before I saw the lightning. I was on ground zero on the top of a mountain with a metal pack frame projecting up over my head. The only sensible thing for me to do was stop and find shelter. So I kept going. Hey, if I was sensible, would I even be on this stupid quest? The ground quickly became a quagmire. Within moments, 3 or 4 inches of standing water covered the trail. My feet were just swimming around in my socks and what was left of my boots. Every time I thought I would never again see it rain so hard as long as I lived, lightning would crackle all around me and rain would pour down even harder. I was shaking with cold even though I was hiking flat out. For a time, it was a race between the lightning and hypothermia to see which would drop me first. I thought to myself, if I can just get through this, I'll be all right. This is the worst moment I will ever experience in my entire life. Then the hail came. Marble-sized pellets of ice pelting off me by the hundreds. They stung like cold fire, especially the ones which caught skin on my hands and face. I tried another primal scream to release frustration, but this one did not do me a damn bit of good. The truly severe rains lasted for little more than an hour. The rest of the trek was merely in a downpour. Flying down 2 miles of slippery Virginia clay in the rain with those crippling shin splints during the final descent was an incredible bitch. The only positive aspect was that I started to become overheated, and the sweat pouring off me indicated that I had shaken off a dangerous case of hypothermia. Time and again, I was well on my way to a nasty fall when I miraculously caught myself. On one occasion, my feet shot sideways and I was plummeting to the ground below, but I managed to grab onto a tree and hold myself up while spinning around it 5 or 6 times. The last 20 feet down to the road were on a vertical mud slope, with no trees where I finally took the backflip I'd been avoiding all the way down the mountain. I got up soaking wet and covered with mud. Looking like that, I was not optimistic about my chances of procuring a ride with my thumb, so I set out towards town at a fast walk, gritting my teeth against the stabbing pains in my shins. A couple of blocks before the post office, I came to a street corner where a lady driving a car was waiting at a stop sign. I saw her staring at me with an expression of concern, but also the look of someone trying hard not to laugh. So I laughed. We both had a good laugh on me. I needed that. I hobbled into the post office at 4:55, having met and conquered every challenge of the grim afternoon. Once again, good triumphs over evil. Or something like that. There are now exactly 1,530 more miles to go.